Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. My name is Jeffrey Smith, and I'm the Associate Dean for University Research Performance and a professor in the College of Education at the University of Otago. As such, I'm proud to be a member of the university's Humanities Division. I wish you all a warm welcome to tonight's Winter Lecture Series event. Thank you to Minister Todd Barclay, on behalf of the University of Otago, for hosting tonight's fourth lecture in the series. The university is honored to be able to hold this year's Winter Lecture Series in the Parliament buildings. I've only ever been here before on the tour, so it's particularly nice for me. Tonight's lecture will be introduced shortly by Minister Barclay, but as you may or may not be aware, Professor Tribble's department is part of the Otago's University's Humanities Division. So before we get to the main event, I'd like to take a couple of minutes to provide you with some background on the university, and in particular, the Humanities Division. And when I say provide some background information, I mean to brag about the university and the Humanities Division. In 2016, the University of Otago received the highest possible international quality rating of 5 stars plus from QS Stars. QS is an international ranking system that reviews universities around the world and benchmarks them against 7 defined areas. It's kind of like TripAdvisor for universities. QS describes our rating of 5 stars plus as a mark of quality and excellence that is awarded to a university which is not just world class, but an elite destination to which the very best students and faculty worldwide will aspire. QS also rates subject areas, and in the 2016 rankings, the following humanities subjects at Otago were rated in the top 100 in the world: archaeology, anthropology, developmental studies, education, my department, English language and literature, Lynn's department, geography, history, law, and performing arts. In addition to those departments mentioned above, Otago's art history and classics, philosophy, sociology, gender and social work, theology, and religious studies departments have all been ranked as first or second in New Zealand for the quality of their research as part of the Performance-Based Research Fund, PBRF, 2012 Quality Evaluation. I should also mention that researchers within the Humanities Division continue each year to secure support from Marsden funding, which is administered by the Royal Society of New Zealand on behalf of the Marsden Fund Council. This program supports excellence in fundamental investigator-initiated research. The 2016 recipients won't be announced until October, but looking at 2015, several departments within the university's Humanities Division successfully secured funding for their research projects, including 2 different research projects within Otago's Anthropology and Archaeology Department. Over $1 million in funding was received to support research into colonists and communities in Papua New Guinea and the health and wealth disparity in Southeast Asia. Secondly, the Theology and Religion Department gained $300,000 worth of funding for research looking at Buddhism, law, and monastic control in Southern Asia. Speaking of Marsden's, going a few years back to 2012, Professor Tribble's own research into the ecologies of skill in early modern England was awarded over $450,000 over 3 years to look at how a range of skills from dance, music, and sport to craft and science were acquired and transmitted from person to person during that era. As you can tell, I love being a part of the intellectual community of the Humanities Division, and I'm honored to be a member of the faculty of the University of Otago. I would now like to ask you to welcome the Honorable Todd Barclay, who will introduce tonight's lecture.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I'd just like to acknowledge you and your department for putting on this evening. I'm actually here on behalf of the Honourable Michael Woodhouse, who usually hosts these events. He's the Dunedin North List MP and a Minister in the Crown, and he passes on his apologies for being unable to be here tonight. But I am delighted to be able to host the University of Otago's 2016 Winter Lecture Series here at Parliament this evening. This is the second lecture series over the last 2 years that I've had the privilege of hosting on behalf of Minister Woodhouse. Although I'm not a graduate of Otago myself, I'm a graduate of Victoria University, but I understand your Vice-Chancellor, Harleen Haynes, makes quite a few references to that, and she never lets me live it down. I am a very big supporter of your university, the contribution you make to the academic sector within New Zealand, and also the business community as well through the commercialisation of a lot of your innovation. Tonight marks the fourth lecture in this year's series, which will be presented by Professor Lynn Tribble. Lynn completed her doctoral study at the University of California, Berkeley, shortly after she moved to Temple University, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where she taught Shakespeare and Renaissance literature. In 2003, she took up the Donald Collier Chair in English at the Otago University, where she teaches Shakespeare and Renaissance drama. She is a board member of the Shakespeare Globe Centre New Zealand and regularly presents workshops at the University of Otago Sheila Wynne Shakespeare Festival. Her most recent book is Cognition in the Globe, Attention and Memory of Shakespeare's Theatre. This book seeks to understand how Shakespeare's company grappled with the enormous attentional demands of their profession. Shakespeare's company performed 6 different plays a week with relatively little repetition, all the while rehearsing a new play every fortnight. How did they do it? Cognition in the Globe turns to the model of distributed cognition, drawing upon new research in psychology, workplace studies, and philosophy to answer these questions. Her lecture is entitled Why Shakespeare Wrote Shakespeare and Why It Matters. She will examine recent debates about Shakespeare's authorship and the plays ascribed to him, and will show why it matters that they were written by the man from Stratford. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Lynn Tribble.
Tēnā koutou. Thank you, Professor Smith and Mr. Barclay, for that kind introduction. 400 years ago, almost to the day, literary and theatrical England awoke to this terrible news. William Shakespeare, playwright and poet, dead at 52. News of Shakespeare's unexpected death rocked Facebook and Twitter and other social media outlets. Shakespeare's longtime frenemy Ben Jonson's tweet that Shakespeare was not of an age, but for all time, immediately went viral. Well, not exactly. The news of Shakespeare's death in Stratford would have made its way fairly rapidly to London, but not with the breathtaking speed in which tributes to artists like David Bowie or Prince are tweeted out today. So accustomed are we to the wealth of knowledge that we have about contemporary writers and artists that the information we have about Shakespeare has seemed to some very slender indeed, although, as I shall show, the evidence is much richer than is often acknowledged. The one thing no one from Shakespeare's own time seems to have doubted was his authorship of the plays. The mistaken idea that there's something suspicious or mysterious about Shakespeare's authorship has wide currency. When I tell people I teach Shakespeare, I brace myself for the inevitable question. Did Shakespeare really write those plays? Sometimes I'm tempted to give the short answer. But in fact, I'm sometimes asked this question by people with an axe to grind, and I'll talk about that a bit more later, more commonly, it reflects genuine curiosity, prompted by a vague sense that there is a mystery to Shakespeare that must be explained. Now, although I have heard this question for well over 2 decades now, relatively recently, it has gained a much stronger foothold in popular consciousness. This is not only due to the efficiency of the internet in spreading false information, but also to the tireless efforts of a group that calls themselves anti-Stratfordians, or sometimes Oxfordians, but whom I prefer to call anti-Shakespeareans. Back in 2011, Columbia Pictures even produced a film dedicated to the proposition that Shakespeare was a fraud. Directed by Roland Emmerich and starring talented actors such as Derek Jacobi and Mark Rylance, this film fully embraced the most outlandish version of the idea that Shakespeare's plays were not written by the man from Stratford, who is portrayed in the film as an unlettered and opportunistic buffoon, but by the Earl of Oxford. Only an aristocrat, so the story goes, could have produced the works we now call Shakespeare's. Perhaps few viewers of the film accepted its full premise that the Earl of Oxford was the bastard son of Elizabeth I, who wrote Midsummer Night's Dream at the age of 9, before himself having an incestuous affair with the queen that produced the Earl of Southampton. Nevertheless, the marketing of the film leaves the distinct impression that there is something fishy about Shakespeare. So this evening, I would like to do two things. First, convince you that this impression is false, that ample evidence exists to link Shakespeare the man from Stratford with his plays, and second, to convince you that it matters. I should state at the outset that I'm not going to engage with the arguments about any particular alternative candidate, whether the Earl of Oxford, Queen Elizabeth, John Florio, Henry Neville, Francis Bacon, or Christopher Marlowe, to name a few. The reason for this is simple. The case for Shakespeare's authorship is so overwhelming that contrary arguments do not achieve minimum plausibility. That is, all alternative candidates are equally implausible. So today I'm going to begin with the bigger picture, and for the next few minutes, just briefly outline some of the reasons that scholars like myself are persuaded that William Shakespeare of Stratford authored the plays ascribed to him. Now, there's an ample amount of documentary evidence that attests to Shakespeare's life. This is the parish register that records the baptism on 26 April 1564 of Guillaumus Filius Johannes Shakespeare, or in English, William, son of John Shakespeare. We also have the bond allowing Anne Hathaway and William Shakespeare to marry on 27 November 1582, and the record of their daughter Susanna's baptism, a hymn 6 months later on 26 May 1583. Finally, the baptism of his twin children, Judith and Hamnet, on 2 February 1585. As some of you may know, sadly, Hamnet died at the age of 11. Now, records such as these are the routine documents of parish life in the 16th century. The vast majority of men and women in this period died without leaving much more than such traces. Now, while Shakespeare left behind little that we would call personal, his life as a playwright, actor, and businessman is more fully documented. Now, following the birth of the twins in 1585, however, 7 years pass before we have further information about him. We can only speculate about what he did between 1585 and 1592. We do know he married very young, at the age of 18. 25 was the normal age for young men to marry at this age, and for young women as well. Anne Hathaway was, in fact, 25, 7 years older than he. They had a child 6 months later, and twins 2 years on. So Shakespeare would have been under enormous pressure to provide for his growing family. Our next piece of evidence shows that he made his way to London, where opportunities for men in his situation would have been greater. In 1592, we have our first mention of Shakespeare that connects him to both playing and writing. Now, we don't know how long he had been in London by this time, but it was long enough to attract some envy from established writer Robert Greene, who published this book, Greene's Growth of Wit, in 1592. It contains the following reference to Shakespeare. I'm showing you this in the original black letter first, but here's a transcription that reads, "For there is an upstart crow beautified with our feathers, that with his tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide, supposes he is well able to bombast out a blank verse as the best of you, and being an absolute Johannes factotum, is in his own conceit the only shake scene in a country." Now, Greene was an author and a playwright himself, and he here aligns himself with established writers against the upstart crow beautified with our feathers. A Johannes factotum, or jack of all trade, Shakespeare is a player as well as a writer. The reference to a tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide is actually also a reference to the line from 3 Henry VI, referring to Queen Margaret, "O tiger's heart wrapped in a woman's hide." This is one of Shakespeare's first hits in the emerging genre of history plays. Now, years later, after Green's death, Shakespeare actually gets his own back at him when Polonius quotes Hamlet's letters to Ophelia, and one of them reads, "The celestial and my soul's idol, the beautified Ophelia." Polonius breaks off to note, "That's an ill phrase, beautified, a vile phrase, a very vile phrase." Now, another indication of Shakespeare's growing reputation as a playwright is that we begin to see his name on the title pages of some of his works. About half of Shakespeare's plays were published in his lifetime in separate editions that we refer to as quartos. Almost no plays at all were published before 1594 by anyone, not just by Shakespeare. And when they were, authors' names were seldom connected to their play texts, which instead were advertised with the name of the company, a synopsis of the play, and, importantly, where to buy them. This is Richard III, as published in 1597, where we get a plot summary, his treacherous plots against his brother Clarence, the pitiful murder of his innocent nephews, tyrannical usurpation, the whole course of his detested life and most deserved death. We have then who acted it, the Lord Chamberlains, his servants, this was Shakespeare's company, and finally, importantly, where to buy it, which is in St. Paul's churchyard at the sign of the Angel. In 1598, we have the first example of a play that actually bears Shakespeare's name on it. This is Love's Labour's Lost, which is an earlier play, but is shown as now corrected and augmented by W. Shakespeare. The following year, when Richard III is published again, it now bears Shakespeare's name on the title page. And in 1608, Shakespeare's King Lear gives him top billing, Mr. William Shakespeare, his true chronicle history. Title pages were advertisements. Extra copies were printed up and pasted around town. So what's on the title pages tells us something about how the plays were thought to sell. Towards the end of Shakespeare's career, we also find additional contemporary testimony to his position as a writer and an author. This is in Sir John Davies' book, The Scourge of Folly, or Satirical Epigrams in Honor of Noble Persons and Worthy Friends. Here, epigram 159 is dedicated to our English Terence, Mr. William Shakespeare. Some say goodwill, which I in sport do sing. Hadst thou not played some kingly parts in sport, thou hadst been a companion for a king. So Terence, of course, is the famous Roman playwright of humble birth, and the epigram also refers to Shakespeare's acting career, one of the few references to the types of roles Shakespeare played. He seems to have been known for playing older men, especially kings. Now, the last and clearest piece of evidence, of course, is the first folio, which many of you naturally will have seen. This appeared in 1623, 7 years after Shakespeare's death. This collection of his plays was edited and seen through the press by John Hemmings and William Condell, fellow actors and business partners and sharers in the company in which Shakespeare had worked, the Lord Chamberlain's men during Elizabeth's reign, and then James's men, or the King's men, after 1603. These men, Hemmings and Condell, were mentioned in Shakespeare's will. They received memorial rings from him. In their introduction to the expensive volume, they declare that it was produced only to keep the memory of so worthy a friend and fellow alive, as was our Shakespeare, by humble author of his plays. Johnson's famous poem to Shakespeare's memory links him to Stratford, particularly the Avon River. All right, so this is only a portion of the evidence available, but I wanted to briefly set it out to show that Shakespeare's authorship of the plays is not an arbitrary belief, but the best reading of the available evidence. In fact, there is more evidence linking Shakespeare to the authorship of his plays than is the case for any contemporary playwright, except for Ben Jonson, who was known to take a particular interest in his own works to the extent of publishing his plays and some of his poems in a deluxe collected edition in 1616. This was seen as rather presumptuous. It was said that other men wrote plays and Jonson works. Still, this wealth of evidence linking Shakespeare to Stratford, to the plays, to acting, is often dismissed or ascribed to a kind of massive cover-up designed to hide the true authors. Anti-Shakespeareans like to proliferate reasons to doubt the evidence, but really the arguments come down to two. We do not have personal writing or play manuscripts in Shakespeare's hand, and second, a man of Shakespeare's background and educational attainment is very unlikely to have written the plays. So those are the two reasons that are often preferred in different kinds of guises. So I'm going to start with the first of these.
From Roland Emmerich, the director who brought you Independence Day, The Day After Tomorrow, Godzilla, and 2012, now brings you Shakespeare.
Listen to this. Not a single manuscript or poem was ever found in William Shakespeare's own handwriting. Not even a letter. And this from a man who is known to have divided his time between London and Stratford. Wouldn't that normally have produced a vast amount of correspondence? If you're away from home for so long, maybe a little note to his wife asking, "How are the kids?" The largest literary hunt in history produced not a single handwritten note of William Shakespeare. Strange, right?
So my first reaction on seeing this clip was, that's it? Your no letters between Anne Hathaway and William Shakespeare? That's your first reason? What other possible explanation could there be for the failure to find ordinary correspondence between a middle-class couple from 400 years ago than a massive conspiracy to hide the true author? But this point, and the related mystery that's often repeated that none of his manuscripts survive, that Derek Jacobi actually says that at the beginning of this film, are often repeated, and at first glance, they seem persuasive. Shakespeare is our greatest writer, the reasoning goes, so why did he not preserve his manuscripts, that is, his original or autographed manuscripts of the plays as he composed them? But the argument turns out to be about as convincing as saying, well, Shakespeare did not appear on any talk shows to promote his books, so he couldn't have been the real author. It fails to distinguish between what we would like to know about the past and what material traces have survived. So I'd like to pause here for a minute and think, how do we know anything about the past, especially how ordinary people, and during his lifetime Shakespeare was an ordinary person, lived their lives? What items of material culture survive? What are destroyed? As the authors of an authoritative manual on Elizabethan manuscripts write, we may start with a truism. Care will be taken to preserve those things recognized at the time as possessing value, and only those things. Things wanted may be lost through carelessness, accident, or uncontrollable decay. Things not wanted may yet survive if they are not in the way, if they do not speedily decay, and if no secondary values lead to their removal or destruction. So this point raises two issues for Shakespeare's manuscripts. What value would have been placed on Shakespeare's autographed manuscripts at the time, that is value because they were his manuscripts, and what secondary values might they have had that might have left to their loss? So first, what value might have been placed on his manuscripts at the time? First, it's important to realize that Shakespeare wasn't Shakespeare when he was Shakespeare. Or more to the point, he was in the process of becoming Shakespeare. That is, most of the cultural value placed upon his work now is a product of his growing reputation over the centuries. Let's not forget that he made his money and worked in the entertainment industry. If we think about a contemporary entertainment industry, how many of you have seen a play in the last, seen a film in the last couple of months? Right? How many remember, of those, how many remember the name of the title of the film? Everyone? How many remember the main actors? The director? The screenwriter? So for us, actors are salient, the title, directors maybe if you're really into cinema, and screenwriters not at all. As we've just seen, the name of the writer in this period only gradually becomes important and to be attached to the play, and many plays were printed without any reference to the author at all. Moreover, the plays that are printed were only a small fraction of those that were performed. And with almost no exception, if a play was not printed, it did not survive. If Shakespeare's fellows had not sought out and collected and printed the first folio, 18 of his plays would almost certainly have disappeared forever, amongst them Twelfth Night, Macbeth, Antony and Cleopatra, and The Tempest. Generally, plays only survive if they have been printed. So between 1567 and 1642, roughly the period we're talking about, it's been estimated that perhaps 2,500 plays were written, 37 of which, more or less, were written by Shakespeare. Of these, 543 survive. We have some copy of them, and the rest are lost. Of those that are lost, we have some trace, at least, of 700 additional plays. So lying behind each of these 2,500 plays that we think might have been performed would have been a chain of manuscripts, the original authorial draft, an approved copy sent to the Master of Revels, the official responsible for licensing books, the prompt book with sound and music cues. And if we count all these multiple copies together, it's been estimated there might be nearly over 12,000 manuscripts at one point. Some in the playwright's hand, most of which written by professional scribes. Of all of these manuscripts, how many have survived? Depending on how you count, maybe 18, maybe 21. And of these, almost none are in the author's hand. They're done by professional scribes or they're presentation copies. So as difficult as it may be for us to accept, authors of all kinds, not just playwrights, viewed their manuscripts as in a utilitarian way, a sort of passage on the way to print and performance, and having no intrinsic value at all. So even a dramatist as concerned with his legacy as Ben Jonson did not preserve his manuscripts, which were seen as redundant once the work had been preserved in print. There is a separate category of so-called scribal publication of things that were meant to be kept, but that doesn't really apply to any of to dramatic texts such as this. I could talk about that if anyone has questions. Now, in the first place, the statement that no plays survive in Shakespeare's hand is actually false. And there's one important and fascinating exception that I'm going to describe in a few moments. But for now, let's think again about these manuscripts. In addition to the full manuscripts produced of each play, each of these 2,500 plays generated even more paper. Every single part in the play was written out for the actors because this was how they learned their roles. So if we use our 2,500 figure and conservatively estimate 12 parts per play, that's upwards of 30,000 slips of paper. And of these, how many survive? You want to take a guess? One from a professional company. There are a couple of others that are for amateurs. This is the part of Orlando Furioso, as written by a professional scribe for the great English actor Edward Allen. Edward Allen was the star actor of the Lord Admiral's Men that performed many of Marlowe's plays. It's estimated that Allen performed up to 70 different parts in a 3-year period as part of a breathtakingly challenging schedule in which companies produced up to 6 different plays a week, as you heard in the introduction. So this left little time for group rehearsal of the sort that's common today. Rather, players learned their lines from documents like this that contained only their own lines and cues. This is a transcription of what you see over in manuscript here. The solid lines represent somewhat the cue. The cue, or Edward Allen's cue is no answer, and there are his actual lines. What you don't know is who actually gives you the cue, how long you have between the times you speak, and so forth. But this turned out to be an extremely efficient way of learning your lines. I argue it's kind of information underload. When you're performing that many plays, you don't really need to know anything you don't need to know. But to go back to the question of all this paper and these 30,000 slips that have disappeared, we have to think ourselves back into the culture of scarcity. So the manuscripts weren't valued for their literary or historical worth. No one thought they had any. Manuscripts meant for the playhouse or the press were discarded after they performed that function. But they did have a strong secondary value. Paper was expensive. It was useful, desirable for many purposes, and had a ready cash value. Now, this is maybe a bit hard for us to grasp. We are awash in a sea of paper. Clean white paper is everywhere. Whenever I finish an essay, I dump reams of drafts into the recycling bucket. But in England in Shakespeare's period, paper was very expensive. It was made from linen rag, and it was mostly imported because linen was scarce in England. People mostly wore wool. Unmarked paper was used solely for writing and printing. If you think about the cost of maybe a very high quality sheet of watercolor paper, that's probably about right. So this state of affairs actually persists all the way into the 19th century when paper starts to be made from wood pulp. So even an author like Jane Austen, there's a moment in Northanger Abbey where the child Catherine is interested in drawing is described, and she draws whenever she can find the outside of a letter from her mother or some other odd piece of paper. Nobody would ever give a child a blank white piece of paper in that period. It's too expensive. So used paper, paper already used for printing or for writing, was sought by bookbinders, grocers, and bakers, as there was no other packaging material available. The 18th century Shakespeare editor, Edmund Malone, stored some of his manuscripts in a cupboard off his kitchen, only to find that the cook had used them to line baking trays. So think about it this way. If paper cost you $20 a sheet, how much would you use? And if someone would pay you $2 in cash for a used sheet of paper, how much would you save? The vicissitudes of what is saved and what's discarded is clear enough really in our own time. If you think about the value of this. This is his first Superman comic published in June 1938. Any guesses as to what that might be worth? In 2014, a pristine copy sold for $3.2 million US. So just have a look around your house. And it's worth this much now precisely because no one thought it had any value at the time, right? It's cheap, down market, trashy, it's liable to be read to death or pitched out by tidying mums. Those papers that have survived tend to skew towards the upper end of the social spectrum. And that's not just because the aristocracy had more money for paper, although of course they did, but also because they possessed stable mechanisms of inheritance and residences. They didn't shift house. They had money for chests, rooms of storage, and to employ secretaries. In fact, the reason we have that one part that I just showed you is because Edward Allen had a sense of posterity, and he sought to memorialize his accomplishments and wealth in the form of Dulwich College, which he founded in 1619. This is, of course, still out. This is a contemporary photo of it that I took a few years ago when I was there, and this is Edward Allen himself. Among the items bequeathed was the chest you see here. I'm sorry that's not that good a picture of it. And containing a treasure trove of records about the Admiral's men, how much money they took from each performance, documents about their profitable bear baiting business, personal letters from Allen to his wife Joan, which were addressed as "my good sweetheart and loving mouse," and telling her when to plant out the parsley and the spinach. This is just a sort of document that we really wish could have survived from Shakespeare's marriage and that Emmerich thinks should have. But the survival of ordinary domestic correspondence of this sort, as opposed to the correspondence of the elite, is extraordinarily rare. And we literally have it because it was in a tiny packet, put in that chest, left to Dulwich College in 1619, and the college is still there. That's why we have those letters. It's very, very uncommon to have that kind of correspondence. So in sum of this part of the talk, the fact that the manuscripts or the letters of Shakespeare don't survive isn't unusual. It's absolutely what we'd expect. Okay, so I come now then to what perhaps is the central tenet of the anti-Shakespeareans, that Shakespeare of Stratford did not have the background to have written the plays. I'll let Roland Emmerich make his case to you again. Sorry about that.
No records prove that Shakespeare ever attended the Stratford Grammar School. Yet the work of William Shakespeare, the writer, shows extensive knowledge of medicine, astronomy, art, music, military, law, and philosophy, as well as aristocratic activities such as royal tennis and falconry. Call me a snob, but even if he was a genius, he couldn't have pulled that one off without leaving at least a trace of his learning. After all, William Shakespeare had the largest English vocabulary of any writer in history. Not quite grammar school level, I would say.
Okay. So, this is a fairly typical amalgam of arguments used about Shakespeare's education. Anti-Shakespeareans assert that the plays reveal knowledge of the courts, of noble households, of foreign lands, of professions such as law and medicine that only someone with direct experience could possess. Now, the claim actually first, I think, exaggerates the extent of Shakespeare's knowledge. Inflated claims about his vocabulary and erudition do him no service. I'll talk about this again just at the very end. He certainly did not have a reputation for exceptional classical learning in his own time. Now, Shakespeare did have experience with royalty and nobility, at least from the perspective of a performer at court and in noble houses. Even so, his plays are not particularly accurate representations of the life of the great nobility. In Romeo and Juliet, for instance, old Capulet runs around ordering his servants to scrub the pans, light fires, and set out the trenchers, behaving more like a provincial burgher than a nobleman with a retinue of hundreds of servants. Shakespeare's interest in Italy was a part of a wider cultural fascination with the country. And even so, the Italian settings of many of his plays are often only superficially realized. In All's Well That Ends Well, a traveler makes her way from Italy to France via Spain. His knowledge of law and medicine is in keeping with that of many of his contemporaries. And in any case, there's a well-known method to gain knowledge about events one has not personally experienced. It is called reading. Shakespeare seems to have done rather a lot of it. And we should not forget what a rich place London was for gaining knowledge by other means, especially conversation, down on the docks, in the pubs, in the markets. Emmerich also repeats the argument that there are no records that Shakespeare attended the King's School, the grammar school at Stratford. This is true, but there are no records that anyone attended this school because they've all been lost. So his closing sneer about a grammar school education grossly misrepresents the sort of training young men received there. In the Elizabethan period, boys were expected to enter grammar school literate in English at about the age of 6. They generally remained there until 16 or thereabouts. Teaching was entirely in Latin and consisted of memorizing Latin verses, making speeches, reading and reciting, classical literature, writing poetry, and performing Latin plays. So this last point brings me to the subtitle of my talk, Why It Matters. At this point, the question is often asked, what does it matter who wrote the plays? They're brilliant in themselves, and no matter who wrote them, we possess them. And in one sense, of course, this is true. If new evidence came to light tomorrow that Oxford indeed wrote some of the plays, and I would have to have a very high bar to accept that, say manuscripts of the plays we now think of Shakespeare in Oxford's hand, account books, a note from Johnson saying the cover-up was going well. But my job would go on more or less as it does now, except for having to revise this lecture. I don't have a particular vested interest in Shakespeare's authorship, nor have I profited from what one anti-Shakespearean wrote in an email to me was the multi-billion-dollar Shakespearean industry. So the people really invested in Shakespeare's biography might be the tourist industry at Stratford upon Avon. But I do want to persuade you that it does matter, and that it should matter to us as a society, because this is a story of educational opportunity and cultural infrastructure. Shakespeare's story is a story of the great things that can happen to cultures that educate their young people. Shakespeare was the product, or perhaps we should say byproduct, of an educational system that had at least partial commitment to social mobility. Under Edward VI, and then again under Elizabeth I, English grammar schools were transformed and a national curriculum set in place. They were founded in order to train the clergy. One of the first central tenets of the Protestant Reformation was the importance of educated ministers who could read the scripture, explain it to their flock, and most importantly, be able to write and deliver compelling and persuasive sermons. Such education became the key to social mobility. Now, early educational reformers were divided about whether education should be restricted to the sons of gentlemen or to be made available to those of the lesser sort, the sons of artisans and shopkeepers, for example. In 1540, Archbishop Cranmer made a strong case for the latter course. The statistic, poor men's children, he writes, are many times endued with more singular gifts of nature, which are also the gifts of God, as eloquence, memory, apt pronunciation, sobriety, and such like, and also commonly more apt to apply their study than is a gentleman's son, delicately educated. What we call nowadays the metrics bear this out. In Oxford and Cambridge, the graduation rate of the highest class of young men attending, the fellow commoners, hovered around 25%. In contrast, the scholarship students, such as Marlowe, were graduated at a rate of 80% or higher. So they needed the education. The aristocrats had their ticket punched already. So it was this system that created extraordinary opportunities for Shakespeare and for others like him. Christopher Marlowe, shown here in his gloriousness, was the son of a shoemaker and became a scholarship student at Cambridge, went to the grammar school in Canterbury, scholarship student at Cambridge, probably from there a government spy, and then one of the most promising playwrights of his time until his death in a tavern brawl in 1594. Ben Jonson was the stepson of a bricklayer, even lower down the social scale, poorly brought up, as he says, yet became one of the best-known classicists, playwrights, and poets of his generation. Their backgrounds were indistinguishable from that of Shakespeare, the son of a glovemaker who made his way to London by performing and writing plays. Now, I don't want to overstate the social mobility on offer. These educational opportunities were not universally available. A plowman's son from nearby Stratford probably would not have been eligible for the grammar school, nor would Shakespeare's sister, as Virginia Woolf eloquently put it in her counter-history of Judith Shakespeare in a Room of One's Own. But for those who could take advantage of the opportunity, social mobility was possible. Shakespeare and his contemporaries, playwrights and poets, were an unintended and possibly unwanted side effect of this educational system, because the very qualities that trained good clergy produced excellent poets, dramatists, pamphleteers. Hundreds of aspiring young men with literary skills and classical backgrounds moved to London in search of work. So the legacy of Shakespeare and of his contemporaries tells us of the serendipities of educational opportunity, the unexpected outcomes that can result from opportunities given to talented young people. So I'd like to pause here for a moment and talk about one example of the ways that Shakespeare's work shows evidence of this kind of training in rhetoric and persuasion that he would have received at the grammar school. So one of the key skills taught in school was the ability to argue in utrumque partem, on either side of the question, a skill that will be familiar to anyone trained in law. Shakespeare's plays are suffused with this technique. It is one of the reasons they're so open and interrogative, so restless and inquiring. The best known of such moments, of course, is to be or not to be. But I'd like to explore another example of Shakespeare's deployment of rhetorical skill contained in a play that was not published or performed until the 20th century. This is going to get us back to the question of the missing manuscripts. So this is the book of Sir Thomas More. If you recall, when I discussed the scarcity of manuscripts, I mentioned that the manuscripts that lay behind publicly performed or published work were very rarely preserved. Once they performed their function, they were turned to secondary uses, like binding books and stopping mustard pots. For this reason, many of the manuscripts that do survive are those that, for one reason or another, did not make it onto the public stage. And one of these, this one, almost certainly has a scene written in Shakespeare's own hand. This handwriting is referred to as handy. Sir Thomas More is a play about the life of the great Sir Thomas More that is written by multiple playwrights, including Henry Chettle, Anthony Munday, and Thomas Dekker, and has one scene that seems to be in Shakespeare's handwriting. Paleographers have argued that the handwriting here bears enough similarities, the secretary hand, to the existing signatures of Shakespeare to be virtually certain that it may well be in his own hand. We could probably be more certain if we had other manuscript survivals besides signatures. Signatures can be a little idiosyncratic. But the handwriting evidence, combined with the evidence of the way this sounds, stylometrics, and I think you'll be able to hear it too, have convinced many people that this is in fact a Shakespeare autograph that is written in Shakespeare's own hand. Now, all plays that were performed publicly had to be licensed by the master of the revels, Edmund Tilney, as I mentioned earlier, and this was to ensure that they contain no sensitive religious or political content. Tilney refused to license this play because it contained a scene of insurrection, the famous evil May Day riots of 1517. Tilney wrote, "Leave out the insurrection wholly and the cause thereof, and begin with Sir Thomas More at the mayor's session," and talk about the mutiny only by a short report and not otherwise at your own perils. You could be thrown into jail for refusal to follow this direction. So these riots, of which he's writing, pitted nativist Englishmen and women against European immigrants. I don't know if this sounds familiar to anyone. These immigrants were thought to speak strangely and to eat odd food, described here as strange roots, and to be stealing English jobs. So the scene that Shakespeare wrote is a scene of insurrection of these native English against foreigners. And Shakespeare seems to have been brought in as a kind of specialist in insurrection scenes that could be written in a way that was palatable to those in authority. If you think about Jack Cade and 2 Henry VI, if you know that play, but more familiar might be the riots in Julius Caesar, written before this play, and then Coriolanus later on. These have a very similar pattern. A speaker attempts to sway the giddy multitude, common folk who are shown to be blown about by every word and to believe whatever they heard most recently. So in the scene I'm going to show you a few lines from, Sir Thomas More tries to quell the riots and ask the rioters what they want. They answer, "We want the removing of the strangers," that is, the immigrants, "which cannot choose but much advantage the poor handicrafts of the city," that is, they are taking our jobs. So More replies, "All right, think about this. Grant them removed. Imagine that you see the wretched strangers, their babies at their backs and their poor luggage, plodding to the ports and costs for transportation, and that you sit as kings in your own desires. What had you got? I'll tell you. You had taught how insolence and strong hand should prevail, how order should be quelled. And by this pattern, not one of you should live an aged man, for other ruffians, as their fancies wrought, with the self-same hand, the self-reasons and self-right would shark on you, and men like ravenous fishes would feed upon one another." So the argument here is that once the rule of law is overthrown, no one is safe. And he asks them to imagine that. This begins to sway the people. They say, "Before God, that's true as gospel." Very similar to the kinds of things people say in Julius Caesar. In fact, there's actually a line that's "friends, masters, countrymen" in this scene. So More then says, "Let me set up before your thoughts, good friends, on supposition." That is, he asks them to think on the other side of the question, to think themselves into someone else's shoes. And this is the second passage. "You'll put down strangers, foreigners," he said. "Kill them, cut their throats, possess their houses. Say now the king should banish you. Whither would you go? Go you to France or Flanders, to any German province, Spain or Portugal, nay, anywhere that not adheres to England? Why, you must needs be strangers. Would you be pleased to find a nation of such barbarous temper whet their detested knives against your throats, spurn you like dogs? What would you think to be used thus? This is the stranger's case, and this your mountainous inhumanity." So we have here in Shakespeare's own hand, and I think it does sound like Shakespeare, a prime example of the kind of imaginative alchemy that great works of art can foster, and that were trained in the very ordinary laboratories of the English grammar school. Further, this play was not written in some kind of splendid isolation or anonymity, but was part of a collaborative process. And that brings me to my final point, that in addition to being a tale of educational opportunity, Shakespeare's is also a story of cultural infrastructure. So if Shakespeare had been born in 1464 instead of 1564, he would not have been Shakespeare, however talented he was, any more than Shakespeare's mythical sister in Woolf's fiction could have gone to London and become a playwright herself. In 1464 and the decades after, the nation was devastated by civil war. Populations had declined markedly because of the Black Death. There were no printing presses yet in England. There were no purpose-built theaters. There were few grammar schools. There was no thriving literary scene in London. But by 1564, and particularly by 1585 to 90, as Shakespeare was coming of age, matters had changed dramatically. London's population had soared, a thriving book trade was publishing an unprecedented number of titles, educated young men were flocking to London to make a living by their pens and their wits, and there were rival playhouses dotted to the south and north of the London city walls. In fact, it is arguable, though not certain, that Shakespeare's initial opportunities in theater came through something we might call government funding for the arts. In 1583, Queen Elizabeth founded what we might call an All Blacks of the theatrical world, siphoning off the best talent from other companies to form an all-star team to take the history of England on the road. This is from an account book authorizing money that had been given to Tilney to choose out a company of players for Her Majesty. So this company was called the Queen's Men, and you can see this play, The Famous Victories of Henry V, containing the Honorable Battle of Agincourt as it was played by the Queen's Majesty's players. This is not the play that you recognize as Henry V. This is a shorter and much more workmanlike, less artistic version of plays that eventually became, in Shakespeare's hand, Henry IV Part 1, Henry IV Part 2, and Henry V. So it's all in one in this version. So we don't have direct evidence that Shakespeare was involved with the company, but I rather think he was. They visited Stratford several times, and no fewer than 6 of Shakespeare's plays are drawn directly from earlier Queensmen's histories. In addition to the ones I just mentioned, there's Richard III, King John, and a play called King Lear, L-E-I-R. All of these follow the plot extremely closely, but immensely complicate the way we see the characters, and of course have a much richer and expressive vocabulary. So Shakespeare's life and accomplishments, I argue, are much more interesting and inspirational if we see them against this bustling, thrusting commercial world within which he worked and within which he and others were fostered. We often use the term genius to describe Shakespeare, and whilst in some ways this is no doubt true, it obscures as much as it reveals. Indeed, I would argue that the tendency we see in the 19th century to begin to idolize Shakespeare, to hold him up as unique and utterly transcending his own time, does him and us no favors. If you work at the Folger Shakespeare Library, you might find yourself sitting across from this painting by George Romney, The Infant Shakespeare, Attended by Nature and the Passions. It's no accident that it looks, of course, exactly like a nativity scene. And it's no coincidence that around this time that the first doubts begin to sound about Shakespeare's authorship in the plays. The play was written around 1791. You're starting to get these doubts coming in the 19th century. The idea of Shakespeare as a deity come down from above doesn't jibe with the practical business records, which are mostly what Shakespeare leaves behind. One reason, I think, perhaps for some of the beliefs that Shakespeare did not write the plays that begin to arise in the 19th and 20th century is perhaps what we psychologists might call cognitive dissonance, or the difficulty of holding two contradictory ideas in your head at the same time. So if you believe that Shakespeare represents the unsullied pinnacle of absolute witness, wisdom, and virtue, the Shakespeare in your head might be at odds with the Shakespeare on paper. And so then you can either admit that the Shakespeare in your head needs some revision, or you can argue away the Shakespeare on paper. So other myths get created, amongst them the narrative of the reclusive and secret aristocrat. But in general, that is not how literary works are produced. One thing that drives literary production is simple, the need for money. Think about Charles Dickens. One of the things that the myth obscures is the persistent and sheer hard work that must have made up Shakespeare's working life. Managing a business, learning lines and acting, writing 37 plays over 20 years and probably having a hand in others, working with fellow actors, touring, this is months on the road, performing at court, keeping up with the competitive environment of the London theatrical world, all the while dividing himself between Stratford and London. For this reason, my preferred Shakespeare is a figure drawn by Lois Potter in her recent biography. The Shakespeare that emerges from her work is, above all, a craftsman, hardworking with a good ear, a capacious memory, a keen alertness to potential material, both through the books available to him and through the thriving theatrical scene in which he worked. Discussions of Shakespeare might polarize against inflated claims of his greatness and iconoclastic debunkings of such myth. Shakespeare's much lauded enormous vocabulary might be a result as much of his longevity as a writer and the number of different subjects upon which he wrote. Yet in an era in which many of his contemporaries died young of violence, illness, and penury, or otherwise sank into oblivion, this productivity itself over many years is extraordinary. Potter concludes by suggesting that in the end it is Shakespeare's theatrical instinct that distinguishes him. His plays show his expertise in how to use suspense and surprise, how to orchestrate vivid characterizations and styles of speech, and how to give actors their opportunities. So the story of Shakespeare I'm telling is not of a divine genius handed down from on high. Instead, Shakespeare was an ordinary man of extraordinary talents, fortunate enough to be surrounded by other talented men and women, friendly and not so friendly rival playhouses, extraordinary actors like Richard Burbage, shown here, as well as the clowns William Kemp, who would have played Bottom, and Armand, who would have played the Fool and Lear and Twelfth Night. Burbage was able to perform plays that we think of as being written for very different ages and physical types, Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, and Macbeth, within about a 5-year period. So great artists, I think, need gardens in which to flourish, and these gardens are planted and tended by others, by those that fund the arts, by those that support education, by teachers, by entrepreneurs out to make a buck by building theaters and printing shops, by long-forgotten veteran actors and playwrights who may have passed along some tricks of the trade from inferior writers who nevertheless tilled the soil, from friends who lent books out, from strangers whose turns of phrase that Shakespeare might well have picked up. It is this collaborative and competitive world that allowed Shakespeare to flourish and to come down to us. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Tribble. I think we'd all agree that was a very fascinating and inspiring presentation of your work. You've certainly convinced me that Shakespeare was, in fact, Shakespeare. I think you've raised some interesting points around archiving as well, because there are probably many people in the arts in our day that could be in a similar sort of situation in hundreds of years' time that might not receive the recognition that they deserve today. Before inviting some questions, I think we'd all like to join me in congratulating you and showing our appreciation of your work to date and sharing your time with us. So thank you.
Thank you.
Now I'd just like to invite some questions for the Professor.
Thank you. I think there's one back here.
Oh, great.
Just wait for the microphone so everyone can hear.
Shakespeare's plays are very good theatre.
Yes.
And I'm struck that the Czech playwright Havel wrote a lot of plays in prison, which didn't work when they tried to play them. So, with the exception of Marlowe, none of the other people mentioned have got any evidence of having been on the stage, or having worked on the stage.
Johnson actually performed. Was
Sorry,
apparently an
of the
actor.
alternatives.
Oh, I see. That's what you're saying. Yes, I'm sorry.
Right. And I just wondered if you could tell us anything about the process of workshopping that probably occurred, given he would have written text and then it would have gone into the group and then it would have been reworked.
Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent question. In fact, it's one of the things I'm quite interested in. So just if we can imagine Shakespeare decides to write Macbeth, right? The company needs to perform something for James, who's the new king. They're now the king's servants. And they think, well, what would James like? Well, he's Scots. We can work in this material about Banquo. We know that he's really interested in witchcraft. This will be a great play. So they send Shakespeare off, and he writes this play up using the chronicles of Holinshed that he used for many of his plays. So once he'd finished his draft, we're pretty sure that the playwright went to the pub with all the actors and read it out loud to them. And we know that because Philip Henslow in his diary records money for these occasions, it's basically, entertainment expenses. And so at that point, the playwright may well have sort of said how he thought it ought to be performed. But in any case, if the company decided, yes, that looks good, the scribe then took the play and made all of those sides that I was talking about. And so what I think seems to have happened is that there was much less group rehearsal and especially probably less formative kind of discussion than there might be in contemporary theater. And this is in part because of practical matters. That is, if you're putting on, as I said, up to 6 different plays a week and you're putting up a new play every fortnight, you don't have a lot of time to explore emotional memory or whatever the kinds of things you might do in a situation where you're maybe having 4 to 6 weeks to perform a play. I think that, so they primarily would have learned their own parts. Actors would, like Burbage would also, if you notice a lot of the plays there seem to be kind of between men and women will have these sort of dual dialogues like Romeo and Juliet. That's also a way of thinking about the master and his apprentice. So he'd be rehearsing the boy at the same time or teaching the boy at the same time he was learning his own lines. It's thought that probably group rehearsal would have been done primarily for fairly complicated plays. Scenes like the banquet scene in Macbeth, you kind of need to make sure you've got the entrances and exits right. And I think you can see some revisions in Shakespeare that seem to be in part a result of maybe something not working or something not being heard quite correctly. And so, because anytime we have more than one text of any of these plays, they're always a little different and sometimes a lot different. So it indicates that there would have been changes that might have happened between the time it was adopted and the time it was performed and then the time it was printed. But I think your larger point is a really good one. It's hard for me to understand why, for instance, really talented and skilled actors like Derek Jacobi think that it's impossible for an actor to have written the plays. I find that baffling. But that because they show, I think, so much evidence of how you stitch a play together. Where that you've got to give your characters a certain amount of time before they change costume, for instance, things like that, entrances and exits, all of that kind of orchestration that happens. Does that answer the question? Yes, there's one down here. Lisa.
Were you going to speculate at all on how the actors coped with these giant parts that they had to do? And just sort of thinking back to my school days, I remember Shakespeare being used as grammatical puzzles to make sure we all understood how various clauses were strung together. So you've got all that going on, and I'm just sort of interested in the memory aspect of it amongst the troupe.
Yeah, that's a great question. Of course, apart from students who become actors or students who are studying things like medicine, the idea of memorizing things is very alien to most of our students. If I ask my students to remember and recite a passage from Shakespeare, they act like I've told them to go to the moon and bring me back a rock. You know, they really find it hard to imagine that. They haven't got that kind of training. It's not the normal thing that's done generally in education now. But of course, so one answer is that people got very, very good at remembering, at verbal memorization just at school. Shakespeare is also, my argument really is these things are kind of distributed. So you write something that's memorable so that it can then be remembered. Use the verse form. And the verse form allows you to give you a sort of structure that even if you forget a line or a word or two, you can improvise in a way that's not even noticeable. For instance, I don't know if any of you have seen those, those BBC plays, films that were done in the 80s, where they wanted to preserve every single word of Shakespeare. They're kind of tedious, a lot of them, but in any case, there they are. And somebody went through and compared those plays, what the actors actually did, against the script, and they found they were all constant mistakes, but no one picked them up. It was like using the word breath instead of death. So it had the same meter, the same general meaning, and nobody noticed. So there's that. And of course now, someone messes up to be or not to be, and everyone's got their hand up. We know what it's supposed to be. So there's, I think, some element of what you might call fluent forgetting. At the same time, a lot of the decisions that take up the time now in rehearsal, especially blocking, aren't needed in an environment where you have no lighting, or that is ambient lighting. And where I think there were shared codes of moving in and across the stage. So some of the things that, again, take a lot of time to work out would be done as kind of rules of thumb. And so I think it was a whole range of things across different agents. So there'd be somebody who was, actors were in charge really of having their own props and so forth, but there'd be someone who made sure the music cues came on. And I think just the other thing is, of course, these companies worked together for many, many years, and they knew each other. And some of the work I've been doing now, I think some of their physical skills, like fencing, would underpin some of their verbal skills, like wittiness. You think about Romeo and Juliet, Taming the Shrew and Kate and Petruchio, or Queen Anne and Richard. There's a sense in which those feel like swordplay encounters. They're verbal wit rather than physical wit. So I think all of those things kind of underpinned this, and it was quite an efficient system. But some of the things that take time now didn't have to get done, just because the conditions were different. You don't have sets. You're not going to build purpose-built sets. And there's a relatively fluid way of staging that everyone knows how to do.
Thank you for that excellent talk. I'm a retired psychiatrist, and as a result of your impending talk, I read a few plays, summaries I might add. They're really marvelous from a psychological point of view, how he describes dreams and guilt and love. It is really interesting, and it's a shame that people have lost interest, probably because of the language barrier, but I think if it was translated into everyday English, I'm sure that they would be read again, because they're so good, really, all of them.
Well, I have to thank you, and I have to put in a little plug for the Shakespeare Globe Centre New Zealand for all the high school students who put on performances, and it really is through an ability and study of it as performance. On the one hand, that allows them to try to get into that kind of language. So it can be done, but you're right. These things. Sadly, of course, Shakespeare is not required to be read in school, and so some of the ability to kind of manage that language it has eroded. But I think the enjoyment of Shakespeare and the sense in which he can resonate with a completely different time and place is something that we do still see. I mean, we saw a production of Romeo and Juliet translated into Tongan at the festival on Queen's birthday weekend that was quite extraordinary. So. There's one down. Yep.
Thank you.
I have a somewhat lighter question.
Okay.
I wasn't aware of this film Anonymous. That was new to me tonight. And I have recently seen the film, as many people here will have, 400 Years of Shakespeare done by the RSC. And my friends and I were discussing it. And the one person who wasn't in there that we felt should have been was Derek Jacobi. And I now wonder if that was the RSC's revenge.
I don't know. I'm going to be at the World Shakespeare Congress, and I can see if
Do
I can
ask.
ask my spies, if they have any ideas. Of course, Mark Rylance, who was the Globe artistic director, was a very much of the same persuasion. And I think it's in both those cases probably what I describe it to what I was saying about the Shakespeare in your head versus the Shakespeare on the page, that I think they have this veneration that they just can't square with the everyday. But I still find it unfortunate, I have to say.
One of the things that strikes me is Shakespeare's sheer productivity, given that he had a pretty busy life already without all that. And you can't help wondering how it was that he did it all. One question is, how does that compare with the other major playwrights of the day? I mean, were they productive in the same region, or was Shakespeare genuinely special in that regard? The second question is, it would seem that one way he did it was by borrowing all over the place.
Yes.
We clearly read the histories. I hadn't realised until your talk that he'd actually stolen, in effect, plots or plays from other writers and improved them.
Yes.
And in the passage early on, that was it someone called Green?
Robert
there seemed
Greene,
to be a
yes.
hint that Shakespeare was dressed in other people's clothes or something. So it looks as though he was doing that right from the beginning.
Yes.
Is that right?
Well, that was the implication of the charge. Actually, there's some evidence that Shakespeare himself complained, and there's a later edition of that disavows this idea of Shakespeare possibly having stolen things. But in the sense, the lines between stealing and borrowing are always probably more fluid in this period. But yeah, so one way he does do it is by looking at, using sources. But then, of course, most playwrights did the same thing. The question of his productivity compared to others is an interesting one. He did write more plays than Jonson, but on the other hand, Jonson wrote quite a few masques and poems as well. The one difference is that he wrote, unlike Jonson's tragedies were hissed off the stage. He couldn't write in that genre. So he had a certain form he was able to write in, but other forms that he wasn't. So Shakespeare, I think, is unique in writing across genres and also in kind of revising his work through time. And how he did it, he must have just been very disciplined. In the same way that if you read Anthony Trollope's biography, it's like, this is a job. You get up and you write from 9 a.m. to 11, and there's no way to do these kinds of things, especially over a long period of time, without having that kind of discipline. He had a contemporary reputation, at least of a little, just after his death, of being someone who didn't really like to go out and party. Aubrey talks about that he'd always send excuses. And of course, unlike Marlowe, Marlowe and Jonson both killed people. Jonson killed a fellow actor in a duel and was almost executed for it. So they were very mercurial people. In fact, my personal view is that Mercutio in Romeo and Juliet is actually is an embodiment of Marlowe as well. So there's a sense in which he kind of plods on in certain ways. And he also, I think, is constantly experimenting. In fact, his later plays were not as successful as his earlier plays, I think in part because he kept pushing the envelope. I imagine the company saying, really, Troilus and Cressida, this is really what you're doing? Because it was hissed off the stage as well.
Didn't he suffer from verbal diarrhea? During the plague, he kept writing. He just seemed to write the whole time.
Yeah, well, in the earlier, in the early plague years, that was when he starts writing the sonnets and so forth, and that seems to be a bid. Nobody knew at the time whether the theaters would reopen, so it was kind of a bid for a different kind of way of making his way in the world, for patronage, that he seems to have abandoned once the theaters reopened. And the other thing to realize is the reason he was able to move up in the world, gain this social mobility, is because he was a sharer in the company. He didn't make a lot of money just writing one-offs for plays. He made the money because he was running a business, essentially, in which he contributed both writing and playing. Yes, there's one here.
I was going to ask this before you gave your last answer, and maybe it's mostly covered, but where do the sonnets fit in? You're saying they were earlier. They seem to be the work of a very educated a man of leisure, perhaps. And what is the market for sonnets? How does that fit in with the rough and tumble of writing plays?
Yeah, that's a really interesting play. They're published in 1609. And when I mentioned the idea of scribal publication, so things like books of sonnets might well have been circulating in manuscript. So that's a different way of thinking about the manuscript, that the manuscript itself was valuable and you circulated it among people who you knew. So the best guess, 1609 is very late for sonnet sequences. They had their heyday in 1590s. The best guess is that many of these were written and circulated probably in private to a smaller circle of friends in the 1590s, and then later published. It seems to be a bit of an amalgam. Like there's one sonnet in there, the worst sonnet, I think, is number 152, and that's the one that he seems to have written to Anne Hathaway, where he makes a pun on Hateaway. And I kind of imagined her saying, "Oh, you're going to put that sonnet in there, aren't you?" And he goes, "Oh, okay, fine." He puts it in there towards the end. So some of them seem to have all been written at one time. And of course, the sonnets are, you can really get into the rabbit hole talking about this relationship between the sonnets and the biography. And that's just, I didn't want to touch that because it's there's so much work that's been done on it and so much effort. But a lot of it involves trying to rearrange them to make them fit a different narrative and so forth. They are quite unusual. There are not other sonnets that are addressed to a young man in the same way that his are. So it's very tempting to speculate biographically about them. But then the sequence itself was a well-known literary form that might have biographical gestures, but had literary conventions as well.
Thank you all. I said at the beginning of the evening how much I love being a professor at the University of Otago. And one of the main reasons is that I get to hang out with people like Lynn Tribble. Thank you so much again, Lynn.
Thank you.
The one question that was not asked is, who is that guy? And what is he doing? And I know what he's doing. He's throwing the hammer. And I want to let you know that one of the things that Lynn does, in addition to being a remarkable Shakespearean scholar, is she's also a terrific hammer thrower. And discus and shot putter.
I'd like to say I'm a mediocre hammer thrower, but it's a lot of fun. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks.